Those of you who are libertarians, part of the libertarian world, have known our next guest as the president of the Mises Institute for the last decade or so, I think. He was the former congressional staffer for Ron Paul in the last several years of Dr. Paul's time in Washington. And he hosts, I don't know if the Human Action podcast, if you haven't heard that, check that out. I like his episodes with Bob Murphy, especially. And he's recently stepped down from the Mises Institute, and it's like, you know, when Babe Ruth at the end of his career went to the Braves, or Michael Jordan went to the Washington Wizards. It's like you think of Jeff Deist and the Mises Institute, and now he's on to something else. And but we're glad we have him here, and I'm sure he's got one other thing about Jeff is he's always, a lot of times he'll start saying something, he'll have an original idea. I'm like, what is he saying? I don't agree with him. About 75% of the time I end up agreeing with him on some of his original takes. But I always want to hear what he has to say, and I'm glad you guys get the opportunity to do that today. So welcome, Jeff Deist. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
You should agree. Well, it's interesting times we live in here, meeting under the banner of the Libertarian Party Kennedy Democrat Caucus. That's exciting. That's a development I hadn't expected. So a lot of people of my generation went through a Ralph Waldo Emerson phase. I don't know how many of you have ever read Ralph Waldo Emerson, but if it makes you feel any better, this was followed up by an Ayn Rand phase. So at least I have that. Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, was really the head of more of a literary movement than a political one in the 1800s. But as a teenager, his essays like Self-Reliance, you know, this idea of nonconformity was very appealing. And so I read a lot of the Transcendentalists, and of course, if you go back to that literary movement, you'll see a thread to a lot of what's happening in modern American society with the transgender movement, for example, and also with the transhumanist movement. So you've got this idea way back with Emerson that we need to sort of shake off these social conventions and be free and be liberated. And if you fast forward with the help of technology into the 2020s, now people are actually thinking, you know, hey, I can not only remove these shackles of society or social opprobrium, but I can actually sort of get rid of the shackles of my actual physical body and be who I want to be. So there's a thread there, and it's a very progressive thread, and we'll get into that. So Henry David Thoreau wrote the article Walden about his solitude, his time in Walden Pond, and he has a quote in that essay called, and I'm quoting him, "I come and go with a strange liberty in nature, a part of herself, freedom from society." So, A Strange Liberty is the title of my new book. It's also the title of my talk for you today, because it struck me now looking back on that as a much older person, that what Walden meant is when he's out, what Thoreau meant when he's out at Walden Pond is that he's free. He doesn't have all the people in town bothering him. He doesn't have to worry about a boss. He doesn't have to worry about a wife. He doesn't have to worry about his bills, whatever it might be. And it struck me that that's a very strange kind of liberty, right? Liberty from other people. Because I understand liberty, as I'm sure most of you do, as the concept of freedom from coercion by the state. So these are two very different freedoms. And I would argue that Thoreau's version is a strange liberty, and not a tenable one either. So if we think about what Walden and Emerson had in mind, and we fast forward to today, I think there's an undercurrent there of a lot of what we see today, which we could almost call two liberties, or even two libertarianisms. There's sort of two competing models here for what people in this room are trying to do. The first sees the 20th century as a liberal triumph, right? We had female suffragettes, we had civil rights, we had social democracy. So liberty in this conception is sort of self-actualization. It's liberation theology, to borrow from the left-wing Catholics. So in this version of liberty, the linchpin for organizing human society or human affairs is consent. Consent is everything. Anything you consent to is A-okay. And of course, since democracy pretends to represent a form of consent, then democracy is good. Democracy is valid. Democracy means legitimate when it comes to governance. That's what consent means when you apply it to the state. But there's another liberty, another libertarianism that views the 20th century as an illiberal disaster. In other words, we had in the West central banks, we had income taxes, we had 2 horrific world wars, we had welfarism, we had state power run wildly beyond anything our grandparents could have imagined. So again, in this second conception of liberty, liberty is freedom from state coercion. Nothing more, but also nothing less. And so in this libertarianism, the whole linchpin is property. Property is the central organizing principle for society, and around that we ought to make our political decisions. So this divide is a pretty tough one to overcome. It's 2 very different worldviews. You see it in America in all kinds of ways. You see it even within the Libertarian Party, which I don't follow as closely as I did a long time ago, but it's still there. So this is the basic divide, I would argue, not just between different views of liberty, but this is more broadly the basic divide in America today. You could call it a positive rights or a negative rights worldview. And so the question becomes, how do we reconcile these? With a Trump or certainly Biden's not doing that, an RFK Jr., can they be reconciled? So some of you may have heard me mention this a few years ago. I think just before COVID, I was watching a PBS special called America Divided, and they had a lot of different guests from both sides as they view it. But anyway, one of them was Steve Bannon, who was the architect, of course, of Trump's 2016 campaign. And so Bannon comes on, he says, look, we're living in post-persuasion America. The goal is no longer to go out and persuade people. The goal is just mobilization, win. And by mobilization, he was talking about at the polls, but increasingly mobilization means in the streets, right? We're seeing that in America. We're seeing that in Europe. Get used to it. So his point was that, look, even with these little things in our pockets that give us the whole sum of human history and knowledge, basically for free, or pay your mobile bill or whatever, you'd think that would make people more broad-minded, more open-minded, more willing to consider other points of view, and also more willing to go chase down facts that might challenge their point of view. He said, no, it's the opposite. People are actually digging in. They're digging in more than ever, and they're less open-minded than ever. And I've thought about that a lot since, and I think he makes a pretty good point. So it's about mobilization, I think, as much as persuasion in the 21st century. I think that's true. Because politics, as we all know in this room, politics has dropped its pretenses. There's no longer this idea that democracy represents a form of compromise, that we have a far left and a far right, and both of them are, gosh, they're kind of screwy, but neither of them get everything they want in a vote, but instead we get some sort of kind of down-the-middle compromise where we can all live with it, and the candidate is some sort of moderate or squish. And of course, we see that's not true at all. All democracy is giving us is intensification of all this hatred and division between us. And of course, it's giving us a permanent bureaucratic class in Washington, which is absolutely impossible to get rid of. And this is an interesting change when we see that politicians are being a lot more open about their desire to vanquish the other side, right? And by vanquish, we still mean that in the political sense. There are worse senses of the word, but vanquish. In other words, if you recall that Joe Biden speech a few months ago where he was against that sort of James Bond red and black backdrop, and it looked very authoritarian. As a matter of fact, if you watch the pressers with President Biden's press secretary person, she doesn't have any pretense of sort of speaking in terms of compromise or trying to appeal to all Americans. I mean, it's just very clear that we're talking to our voters. Everyone else is wrong and bad, right? And so there was never a golden age in American politics where everything was hunky-dory and people were well-intentioned. There was never a time in American history where politics wasn't a very underhanded and brutal struggle for for power over turf, because that's what it is. Politics is a battle to control the state apparatus and thus control turf, and the turf is us. So that's what politics is. So I don't want to act or imply that there was ever a golden time in politics, but what's changed is the brazenness of the politicians themselves, the degree to which they're just willing to say this out loud. That has changed. I mean, you can talk to your grandparents, for example. It wasn't that long ago in America. You might go to someone's home, and above their fireplace, they might have a portrait of JFK. It wasn't that long ago. I would say if you go into someone's house today and they have a portrait of Joe Biden over their fireplace, you might want to get them some help. But nonetheless, politics really has dropped its pretenses. There's something very different about the world today. And I think a lot of this was accelerated by things we scarcely could have imagined even 10 years ago. Obviously, the crisis of 2008 was a big deal, but in the 2010s, it was Brexit. It was Trump defeating Hillary, which I think sent the entire progressive left into sort of a psychological tailspin of sorts, of cope, because they were sure Hillary was going to win. That was just absolutely guaranteed. And when that didn't happen, I think the left had to respond, not by sort of reassessing themselves, but by saying, oh my gosh, it had to be the Russians, or it had these deplorables, these people are beyond the pale. And so this demonization that we find not only occurring within politics, but actually encouraged by politics, because that's how you get political power, it's just accelerating and intensifying in a way that perhaps we didn't anticipate. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with all these people in this country who are crazy? Who view strict adherence with their worldview as the basis for being a good person, or for even being allowed to operate in society, to have a job or a bank account or be allowed to vote. I mean, it's very, very tough. And oftentimes, we don't even sense it around us. We become like the fish swimming in the goldfish bowl who don't realize that we're in water, right? We don't understand what water is because it's all around us. It's so pervasive, and we're swimming in it. So I'll give you an anecdote. I like anecdotes that support my worldview. Those are my favorite anecdotes. So at the Mises Institute a few years ago, we had to make some changes to our corporate documents, our bylaws. One of our board members at the time suggested an attorney who specialized in corporate governance for nonprofits. Okay, great. So we called her up. She had a very fine resume. She had gone to an Ivy League law school, and she worked at a kind of fancy law firm. And so we hired her, and she made the changes that we wanted. Great, didn't think much more about it. So a few years ago, we needed to make another change, and we hadn't been in contact with her for 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it was. And so we said, remember her name? What was her name? Looked through the emails. And so I found her, and I sent her an email. She had actually changed firms, but nonetheless, I tracked her down. I said, hey, remember us? You did a little bit of work for us. Would you do some more? And she responded back, and in her email now with the new firm, it had in her little signature line, it said she, her. Okay, and this was just a year or two ago. And I said, anybody who's been in legal circles, whether law schools, law firms in general, tend to run pretty progressive left. So there's nothing shocking about this. I mean, it's pretty understandable that a lawyer at a fancy law firm in the Northeast would happen to be, the kind of person who wants to put their personal pronouns in an email signature. And then I started to think about it a little more. I mean, clearly she was comfortable doing so. It never occurred to her in her bubble that, this would ever alienate a client or a potential client. So she was comfortable putting it in there. So that was my first takeaway. And then I thought some more, and I thought, not only is she comfortable putting it in there, her firm may have encouraged that. Her firm may even have required that. I don't know. I didn't freak out. I didn't try to cancel her. We hired her a second time. She had done a good job for us. She did a good job for us the second time. That's fine. She wants her personal pronouns in her email tagline. But then I started to think, what if her email tagline said, Sic Semper Tyrannis, by her name? What if her email tagline said, come and get it? What if her email tagline said, "Make America Great Again"? Do you think her firm would be okay with that? Do you think they would encourage that? No, they would not. And so I thought to myself, if I were to ask her about this, why do you put this political statement, she, her pronouns, in your tagline? She'd say, oh, no, Jeff, that's not political. I'm just being inclusive. I'm just being a good person. That's not a political statement. And but if she'd had "Make America Great Again," that would be like, that would be absolutely beyond the pale. So the fish swimming in the fishbowl don't even realize the politicization of the language and the customs they're swimming in. So that's where we are. We live in this hyper-politicized society, and yet they want to tell you it's not political. It's just being a good person. It's just being inclusive. So not all that long ago, my grandparents explained to me how in their household they made a conscious decision to never discuss politics or religion or sex, in mixed company in their home, because that was just something you didn't talk about. Whereas today, it seems like we've completely thrown that out the window. So for them, politeness was their currency. And why antagonize people or create ill will over these private things like politics or religion or sex? Not so private anymore. So when every facet of life is hyper-politicized, race, sex, sexuality, family, marriage, money, career, all of this is a political statement. This, by definition, aids and abets the progressive left, because their project is all based on leveraging this sort of Stalinist, Leninist who-whom distinction, friend-enemy distinction. That's the carrot and the stick. And we're seeing that with this new proposal to add a mortgage surcharge to people with higher credit scores. Right? There's not even a pretense that that's like good public policy or a good incentive. It's simply reward and punish. Right? We're Democrats, we're in power, time to reward some constituencies, punish others. So it's out in the open now. It's out in the open in a way it wasn't when I was a young guy. So this forces us to change our whole political calculation, doesn't it? And our whole approach to trying to make change in the world. It forces us to reimagine everything. And so now the political calculus, at least the start of the political calculus, and we're about to enter, don't forget, this horrific every 4-year harm ritual called presidential election. The first point of inquiry with any candidate has to be very simply, does he or she hate my guts? That's the first question you have to answer before you get to anything. And when I'm watching RFK Jr. on TV, or on Twitter the other day, I think it felt like the answer is no, he doesn't hate my guts. So, politics has devolved. We want to talk about policy. We want to talk about arcane parts of the tax code or something. Wow, we are so far from that today. So if we're going to operate effectively in this environment, we have to be clear-eyed about the environment itself, about the rules of engagement, let's just say. Politics isn't war, and we shouldn't say that, because I think that does a disservice to people who have seen actual war. But politics certainly suggests violence. Right? That's the currency. That's the undercurrent in all political statements. People who simply don't want to fight or don't realize that a fight is taking place are at a tremendous disadvantage. So, we as libertarians, we like the idea of ideas, debate, logic, persuasion. All of these things, they satisfy the sense we have of fairness and honor. But they're only effective if they're widely accepted among other people and the results are adhered to. Right? We're not required to delude ourselves about this or turn the other cheek just to be good people and hold on to our humanity. So these rules of engagement under conditions of a very strange liberty, they may seem obvious and common sense, but nonetheless, these are really helpful for your friends, your family, the normies in your life who don't fully grasp the situation. And let's not forget, it's a strange liberty when we lock down the country over a virus, for example. That's an awfully strange liberty for the freest country on earth. So, again, most politicians have dropped their pretenses, especially at the federal level. So the first rule of engagement is you have to assume bad faith in political matters. It's like when you walk into a bad neighborhood, you lock your doors on your car. Lying, gaslighting, subterfuge, these are the operative tools in politics today to win elections and more importantly, or as importantly, vanquish the other side. So this isn't the cynicism, let's say, of my grandfather's day, where you'd say, oh, this gang of crooks. This isn't a period scandal like Watergate or Iran-Contra or something like that. Today, we have to actually entirely rework our understanding of modern U.S. politics and understand it really as that precursor to violence, rather than any kind of mechanism for governance or dispute resolution or getting along. So Americans, I think, feel this. They sense this, even if they can't necessarily verbalize it. It's this brutal winner-take-all element to our politics. So consensus has nothing to do with it anymore. Democracy is basically a cheap moniker for when progressives win. So your default position, in my view, for any political statement or proposal or candidate has to be disbelief, an assumption of bad faith. And along with that, we have to assume the institutions, too, like the candidates, are politicized. So whether we like it or not, the intermediary, the non-governmental institutions in society that used to have such a big role, they don't really operate anymore as a buffer between the individual and the state. They've basically been eroded down to nothing, been almost entirely captured by progressive ideology, and they become political organizations that promote political viewpoints. So, you could look at anything from mainline Protestant denominations, you could look at the Catholic Church, Catholic leaders, you could look at the American Civil Liberties Union, you could look at the Boy Scouts of America, anybody in between. Corporate America. We can no longer assume that their stated purpose is their actual purpose. We have to assume a political purpose. And we no longer assume that their public stances can be separated from politics. So bureaucratic control of institutions means that not only does this place them at odds with their original purpose, or ostensible purpose, but it gives them a whole new task, a whole new agenda of serving the progressive project. And I think you have to view it that way. Similarly, you have to assume that all business is politicized. We don't have the luxury anymore of just saying, hey, Budweiser, Bud Light, they just want to sell as much beer as they can. Maybe. But medicine, education, law, banking, accounting, insurance, pharmaceuticals, the tech world, they've all been enormously affected. So Michael Rechtenwald has this great term he uses, governmentalities, by which he means ostensibly private market actors, but they willingly take on the role of the state, the imperatives of the state, the message of the state. So you've got DEI and ESG programmers, for example, in the mix, and almost all U.S. public companies today, they toe the government line, in effect, when it comes to any manner of political position. And I think this means that the future of this country, if it's going to be a happy one, it really resides with the smaller and oftentimes heroic privately held companies. They have to be the true private sector drivers of the economy. The only place where real win-win, bright spot capitalism is even happening anymore. I think corporate America, public companies, too far gone. We also have to treat public policy, one of my least favorite terms, as just a euphemism for politics. There's a lot of organizations in D.C. like to talk about public policy. I think we're too far gone for that. D.C. is so far gone. If you turn on hearings on C-SPAN, ostensibly talking about public policy in a particular congressional or Senate committee, you'll see that it's just pure grandstanding. One side just grills the bad witnesses and gives slavish attention to the good witnesses from their perspective, and then the other party does the opposite. I mean, no one's trying to arrive at truth or some sort of better or more efficient or cheaper public policy. So again, public policy in a hyper-political environment is just code for politics. There may have been a time when you could actually say, hey, they were nonpartisan think tanks and they were laboring away in the basement of some agency, but politics, not policy, is what drives laws, federal lawmaking, and the administrative state. If Joe Biden, for example, manages to enact his student loan forgiveness bill, that's not policy, that's politics. That's whom, hurt, or reward. That's all that will be. There'll be some intellectual cover or some veneer provided by the Brookings Institution or something like that, but it's no different. George W. Bush did that with Medicare Part D, which was just a naked sop to get seniors to vote for him against John Kerry in 2004. I mean, this is just pandering. So public policy conceptually is just dead in the water. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's okay with us in this room, because remember, we don't need policies, right? We don't need monetary policy, we need housing policy or energy policy, we need markets. So that doesn't mean we can't participate in policy debates or support, suggest, an actual tax cut, for example. But what we shouldn't do is allow this pseudo